Okay, hey there, another day, another adventure, right? So what you have to look at now is assignment 2, which is right there. I'm going to click on that. And assignment 2 materials. All of your reading is going to be in part 1. That's for the first part of the packet. And that's the actual first chapter of Metamorphosis. And then for the next part of the packet, it's going to be part 2. And here's a slideshow that you'll have, as well as a resource. If need be, I will be posting the video of this right there when I'm ready. Again, this takes some time, so I should be uploading about 24 hours after the meeting. But let's go ahead and look at the packet in itself. When you click on this, you should have your own copy already. So all you'll have to do is just type here and answer the questions. Seems simple enough. And if you look here, let's look at question number 1. What is happening to the main character, Gregor? What is he becoming? And use concrete evidence, so use text evidence. And I need 2 sentences. If you are stuck there, I have sentence frames for each question, except for a couple of them, which are going to be more paragraph responses. So, what is happening to the character, Gregor? What is happening to Gregor is, finish the sentence, please finish it in the type here box. Makes my life a little bit easier. And then, if you need help in terms of using proper MLA format, it's going to be, this is seen when the author states, use your text there. And then, last name of the author is Kafka, which is right there. Please spell it correctly. And then, I want you to use the line number from the work. Don't use page number. You're supposed to do that typically, but we're not looking at the whole novel. We're just looking at one chapter. And you just keep on doing that. I also highlight lines for you to reread if you're stuck. This work is a lot more dense in terms of ideas that it's trying to process. So because of that, I'm trying to guide questions as much as possible. But you can see right there, line or lines to read again. Same thing here. And if you ever look at how many sentence frames I provide, that's how many sentences I should expect. So this one, I would say that you need 2. But that's going to be part 1 of the packet. Goes all the way down to this paragraph right here. So again, if you see 4 sentences, it's not officially a full paragraph, but that's how much of a response I want there. And then here's your paragraph response. At least 5 sentences. This is going to help me as much as possible. And we're going to look at how we're doing in terms of using in-text citations, because that's going to be our quiz for next week. That's it for the Metamorphosis. If you look at part 1, this is your PDF. If you download it through Adobe Reader, you should be able to highlight a text like that. It's not going to be perfect, but it should save you some time if you need to. And line numbers are on the left here. And that is the part 1 of the reading. Part 2 is the graphic novel that we're looking at. And again, the second part of the packet is going to be a little bit easier. It's more of just a personal opinion and whatnot there. Okay. And if you ever need any help, so this is week 1 under classwork. If you scroll down to the bottom now, I have writing help for you. And I have 2 materials here. We're going to look at that in just a moment. But let's go ahead and look at the PowerPoint. All right, here we are. Okay, Metamorphosis, The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. Probably the one of the most famous texts of existentialism. And that's what we're looking at. And the main idea is just looking at a person that wakes up one day and becomes an insect. And we don't know which one it is exactly, but we can assume that it's a beetle. So let's look at the first idea. Socrates once said, "The life which is unexamined is not worth living." And what Socrates was trying to say is that if people aren't looking at the choices that they've made in their life, they're not really living. They're just being an animal. So in order to make sure that we get the most out of our lives, we need to, from time to time, examine ourselves and the world around us. So that's the major question of the whole book, The Metamorphosis, which you can read if you want to as your book review list. And the question is, did Gregor Samsa examine his life? And that's what we're looking at right now. Just some background info. The novella was written in 1912, and novella just means a short story. So I believe Metamorphosis is only 80 pages, and a lot of people think that's an easy read, but it's so short that and concise, but it has so many major topics to discuss about that it's often a challenging book to read, even though the word count isn't super complex. Just the ideas it's trying to discuss is. And Franz Kafka is our author. I believe it's 1883. He's not Methuselah. He doesn't live forever or hundreds of years. It's 1883 to 1924. He was born in Prague, which is now the Czech Republic. And when you look at the story, a lot of what it's writing about is fear and judgment of his family members. And this is a lot of the expression written by Franz Kafka, because a lot of his life he was afraid of his father. And when you read the first chapter, I think you can see that too. So these are just some quotes that he's written about his father over his life. He said, "As a father, you have been too strong for me, and for that I was much too weak. Your opinion was correct, every other was mad." Basically saying that you're always right, and you're never wrong in your eyes. And then finally, you turned in me to mistrust of myself and perpetual anxiety about everything else. So, when you look at this person, it seems like it's a character or an individual that's experienced a lot of anxiety and stress in his life, and you can really feel that in the work that he wrote. And let's look at his most famous story, which is really like the first thing that people often read when they're looking at the philosophy of existentialism. And the main idea is that it writes about the separation and alienation of the modern man. And more specifically, that the economic production of creating something is more important than the well-being of a person. And a lot of this just comes from the 10s, where you would have a lot of monopolies, and it was more important to create a product than to make sure that people are having good working conditions. Even right now, in certain factories, we call them sweatshops because they are violating certain rights of people. Oftentimes, some companies are denying people to use a bathroom break because it's slowing down production. Same thing, a lot of production lines of the 1970s and 80s had a downturn in terms of build quality, because the main idea was that it doesn't matter if you see a flaw in the product. If you shut down production, you are costing jobs and you're going to lose your job because of it. And it's looking at how our modern society, which really was beginning to turn out in the 20th century in terms of having this idea of like an industrialized job and creating something, and our modern day economy is kind of like being formed in the 1910s in this era. And it's looking at the stress involved and anxiety and bitterness of trying to just exist. When you see this, I think a lot of parallels or comparisons can be made to modern day, that people right now, even if they're given 6 weeks of vacation, most people right now will not take the full amount because of the fear that it will make you look like that you're not working hard enough. And Rockstar Games is another example of this, that right now, today, they've already addressed some issues of Red Dead Redemption 2 and how some employees were expected to work 100 hours a week for the last couple months. And now because of that, they're changing their business model so that people are able to not have such of a stressful environment. In the 1910s, just another reminder, the idea of working 40 hours a week, that wasn't put in place until the 1930s of the New Deal. So it was expected that people worked as long as possible to make sure that they were able to continue to produce and create things. And these are just some questions that the book talks about. I don't think we're going to see it as of yet. You might see some beginnings of it, but if you read the whole book, you'll start seeing these questions a lot. So the first question really is that this transformation of a person becoming a beetle or an insect, is it only psychological? And is this in Gregor's mind? The second one, is this a physical or actual transformation? Is the text trying to say that we know that this is fictitious, and in this story, we're going to make this a literal transformation? And with that literal transformation, the story, how are we going to get meaning out of it? Or maybe, is it a struggle of both physical and psychological? So if it's a person concerned about working in a factory setting, is that struggle of them transforming into an insect which isn't as mobile? Is that part of the long hours that they're working from? Or is it psychological, or is it a combination of both? Some more questions. This is more for you. Are you looking at that if you were in this same situation, how would you react to this nightmare for most people? And another question is that even with his morphing into another animal, what is he escaping from in that regard? Because there are other stressors that he no longer really has to worry about, because it's so low on the list of things that are real problems now. And another question is that, is this transformation of a beetle, is this what Gregor thinks that his true self is deep down inside? Is he just this mindless thing that is working because there's nothing else to do, and there's no free will because of it? And in this transformation or metamorphosis of becoming something else, is that a rejection of certain responsibilities? In the book, Gregor, our main character, he is the main provider of his family, and I believe he's in his late 20s, and he's still living with his parents because his parents have a lot of debt, and it's his responsibility to get them out of it. In fact, he's going to be working for this terrible company for a couple more years just so that his parents no longer have to have this debt. And then the final question really is that, is this just a story of anxiety and a representation of what people might express and feel right now? If you look at the data right now, anxiety and depression is the highest it's ever been for people. And in some regards, I think we have a lot of luxuries to worry about, or a lot of luxuries that we don't have to worry about major things anymore. We aren't expecting to have a bear come in and eat us. But what we have instead is this low-level stress of expecting to meet deadlines constantly. Even right now, you are expected to decide what your entire life will be by the time you graduate high school. And for some people, that's extremely stress-inducing, and it builds anxiety. So when we're reading the story, please just think of that in the back of your mind of what is Franz Kafka trying to explain, and what is he trying to represent in his work? Just a major vocab to think of. A lot of this, so grotesque or black humor, even though this novella can be expressed as almost like a horror novel, because it's a person transforming into a beetle. When you look at the absurdity of it all, some people would say that it's grotesque or black humor. And a lot of that is often used to help release some tensions of the modern world. The most recent example that I can think of is during the height of the Cold War, when people were afraid that Russia and the United States were going to drop nuclear bombs and kill the entire world. They had a comedy come out called Dr. Strangelove, where that was the whole premise. And it was a comedy, and people thought it was very humorous. And as a way, it's a way to escape from the realities of the world, but also recognize and see the absurdity of some of these topics. So the major ideas of grotesque or black humor is that it's often characterized by distortion and bizarre and outlandish, and this is often absurdity. For Metamorphosis, the mere fact that we know that this person is turning into a beetle is absurd and strange, and because of that, since it's such a strange predicament to be in, we find it humorous. And another thing to know about grotesque or black humor is that it uses sardonically humorous effects derived from sharp, wit, or grotesque situations that deal with anxiety, suffering, and death. And that is the basis of everything, is that you're seeing these really serious subject matters being and taken very lightly. And we will call that dark humor now, or maybe like edgy humor. And if you think about that, that has been going on for hundreds of years. Even Shakespeare, a lot of the jokes put in place of his plays are extremely dark in fashion. And finally, for grotesque or black humor, the tone or the attitude of the story is often of resignation, anger, or bitterness. And we can see that when you read this first chapter, people are upset. Some people have extreme anxiety, and some people think that it's not a real problem and they just need to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. The next term to think of is expressionism. These ideas are coinciding with the concept of existentialism altogether. So, expressionism is a visual art form that started in the early 20th century, and instead of trying to create a realistic painting, you're going to show something more about feelings, cause, and response. So the use of symbolism was much more apparent. Exaggeration, nightmare, distortion, imagery, and fantasy. The most famous author that we can think of is Van Gogh. That's the picture on the very bottom left of your screen. And in some ways, it's not realistic at all. But when you look at the sky patterns of that time, mathematically speaking, it's extremely accurate. And the more important thing was trying not to make something look exactly what it is in real life, but the feelings that the artist was having at that time. The painting above, Scream, is another idea of showing stress and anxiety of things that are going on. And that's expressionism. This is similar and relates somewhat to surrealism, which is super realism, and also it started in the early 20th century in France, and it was the counterculture of realism in art. So because of that, it is looking at imagination, and it's having dreams over the consciousness and having control of things. When you see that the most famous artist is going to be Salvador Dali, and he's the one that drew the melting clocks on the bottom right there. And in terms of plays and skits and humor, this is very similar to avant-garde humor, which is just absurd and strange. And you see this a lot, and it's, again, a reaction of trying to see, how are you able to look at the world in a different lens? And how does that help promote emotion and concepts that people weren't really thinking of before? And finally, that's where we lead towards existentialism, which is looking at, it's kind of a philosophy, and it's looking at how does someone cope with the decisions that they have in their life, and how do they react to that? And this became an art form that eventually adapted into a philosophy. And what's so amazing about existentialism is that it's extremely difficult to express what's about, and the best way to show existentialism is through writing a story about a person's journey or life. And prior to this, the concept of having fate decide for everything was a major event that you didn't have a lot of control. And this kind of started the idea, on a grand scope, globally speaking, that people had choices. And a lot of situations that they're put in are partly or even mostly based off of the choices that they already made. And when you look at this, it's more of an idea of looking at, there's some things that we can't control, but what we can control is how do we react to those situations. And this goes all the way out into the early 1800s, and before that, it was more of having this is a path that was told for you, and you don't have a say in it. And that was beginning to change. And if you look at the comic book strip by Snoopy, I think it explains a lot. It's where am I going? What am I doing? And what is the meaning of life? And up until this moment, like, that concept didn't really start yet for people to think about. Like, what do I want to do when I grow up? Who do I want to be? Before that, it was more of the expectation that here's what society is going to tell you what to do. You're 13, you now need to work at a coal factory, or coal mine rather. So when we're looking at the metamorphosis, I want you to start thinking of Gregor and some choices. It feels like he doesn't have control, but did he, like, where were the places that he did have control? And also, whenever you have existential work, is to try to look at your life now and choices that you've made, and not become depressed of like things that you didn't do, but take motivational action and change things that you want to do. So the metamorphosis is one example of a person that becomes something and realizes that he's done a lot of things that he should have done differently. And it's the same thing with a playwright called Rhinoceros, where people were giving up the ability to be a human and having these really difficult choices to make in life, and would rather go through a process of becoming a rhinoceros because you are just thinking like a rhino. And because of that, if you are eating and sleeping, you're happy. And that's what we're trying to juggle with, is that is the more difficult decision, is that sometimes the better choice than having something that gives you immediate pleasure. And finally, this leads to the concept of why read the Metamorphosis and other works. When you're looking at your book review, I think this begins to start thinking, we have this idea and we're conflicted all the time of these expectations of what we have. Right now, I have this juggling act of how am I now able to separate my work life and going to school, my personal life, when it's in the same room now. And it kind of conflicts with this idea of like freedom and responsibility to not only society, but also your family. And with that conflict, guilt sometimes arises, and this reaction is sometimes the only escape for people. So when you see this, I would look at the concept of like, what does society expect us to do? And how does that coincide with our choices that we want to do and what we want to become? And this leads to the basic concept, the 4 points of view. So really there are 3, but third person breaks down into 2 things. So first person is I, us, we statements. And when you see that, think of like a first person shooter, that you're just seeing it in their eyes. Second person, you will rarely see in a fiction, but in nonfiction, it can be used as a way to build an argument of like, would you do this? You do that. And it's often seen in nonfiction. And third person limited is when a narrator is present describing what's happening, but the only thing that they know are what is being described right then and there. So they only know what the person is saying and the reaction of the other individual. Versus third person omniscient is when a character knows everything, or the narrator knows everything. And you see this a lot in terms of like children's stories, that they're able to express everything that's going on. And I think the most, a really good example of this would be Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. But most narratives, or most stories rather, are written in third person limited, because it's the easiest way, and it's also the simplest. Slaughterhouse 5 was third person limited. Another idea is to look at infer. We have a lot in our packet, and that's just as looking and coming to a conclusion with the evidence that is provided to you. And then dehumanize. When we're looking at this, dehumanize, we see a lot, and it relates to taking rights and humanity away from an individual and treating them less than human. And we see this a lot. One example, if you look at the image there, that's Auschwitz, a concentration camp. And that clearly dehumanized people. And not to the same extreme, but how is it that Gregor, our character, feels like he is being dehumanized because of these societal expectations that not only has he chosen to be a part of, but people have forced him to be in. And one example would be, at the time, factory workers of the 1910s, how their management methods can impose fear on people and dehumanize them. And then finally, metamorphosis is change in nature that is becoming something else. So a caterpillar becomes a butterfly, a larva can become a cockroach or a beetle, and then a tadpole can become a frog. And that's really what we're looking at, is that it's changing into something else. And that's what our main concept is of the metamorphosis. So just a refresher, in the packet, please make sure that you are citing properly and using MLA format and using signal phrases. Basic signal phrases is basically the author's name and a verb. So this is seen when the author claims, your quote, end with the last name of the author and line or page number. For our packet, we're going to be using line numbers. On the left here, I have a whole breakdown of some ideas instead of just saying this is seen when the author claims, but you're going to have mentions, refutes, endorses, asserts, argues, overlooks, admits, acknowledges, concedes. So this is a great way to differentiate your signal phrasing and your quotations being put in place. And an example that I have is that this is seen in the text. In the text, when the text describes George being too intelligent and needing, quote, a little mental handicap radio in his ear. Vonnegut, line 13. And that's just what I want us to look at when we're doing that. And I have writing guidelines in the classroom to help you with that. And sentence frames are in the packet. So if we go back over to our content, so under classwork, if you scroll down, go past week 1 and you look at writing help, I have a cheese blend write-out that I gave way back in trimester 2 as a guideline, and once it loads, and I break down how to write a body paragraph, and that's on the second page, and it's written right there. And then I also have an MLA signal phrase handout, and this just helps break down how to properly use signal phrases and complete sentences in your citations. And yeah, that's about it. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I will see you on Monday.